Some people vanish without a trace, others are found. But what happens when the person who comes back isn't quite the same person who left? What happens when survival itself becomes the mystery? This is the story of a man who died in the mountains. Except he didn't, and that's the problem. February 14th, 1982, St. Valentine's Day. While most of America was buying flowers and chocolates, a 34-year-old geologist named Stephen Kubacki was lacing up his hiking boots in the frozen wasteland of Lake Michigan's eastern shore. Stephen wasn't the reckless type. He was methodical, cautious, a man of science. He'd grown up in these woods. He knew the ice. He respected it. But on that particular Sunday afternoon, Stephen decided to go cross-country skiing alone along the frozen dunes near Saugatuck, Michigan. It was supposed to be a short trip, 2 hours, maybe 3. He told no one where he was going. He packed light, skis, a small backpack, a thermos of coffee. The temperature was dropping fast, 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind chill made it feel like 0. But Stephen had done this 100 times before. He wasn't worried. At approximately 2 p.m., Stephen left his car at a small trailhead and disappeared into the white. The sky was overcast, gray, oppressive, the kind of sky that makes you feel small. He skied along the ridge overlooking the frozen lake, moving steadily through the pines. And then nothing. When Stephen didn't return that night, no one noticed. He lived alone. He had no girlfriend, no roommate. His absence was invisible. It wasn't until 3 days later that a colleague at the university called his apartment. No answer. That's when the search began. February 17th. A search party found Stephen's car still parked at the trailhead, untouched, covered in snow. They followed his ski tracks into the forest. The trail led them to the edge of Lake Michigan, a massive frozen expanse stretching out like a pale desert. And there, at the shoreline, they found something that made their blood run cold. Stephen's skis, his poles, his backpack, all neatly arranged in the snow, as if he'd carefully placed them there, as if he'd decided to walk out onto the ice and never come back. The ice on Lake Michigan in February is deceptive. It looks solid, thick, safe, but underneath, there are currents, weak spots, fractures you can't see until it's too late. The search team scanned the frozen surface. No body, no blood, no signs of struggle, just absence. Divers were called in, but the water was too cold, too dark, too dangerous. After 2 weeks, the search was called off. Stephen Kubacki was declared missing, presumed dead, likely drowned beneath the ice. His parents held a small memorial service. His colleagues mourned quietly. The case was filed away. Another winter tragedy. Another name on a list of people swallowed by the Great Lakes. But here's the thing. Stephen Kubacki didn't drown. He didn't freeze to death. He didn't die. Because 15 months later, on May 5th, 1983, Stephen woke up, not in a hospital, not in a morgue, not in the icy waters of Lake Michigan. He woke up in a field in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, 700 miles away, wearing clothes he'd never seen before, with no memory of how he got there. And that's when the real mystery began, because the man who came back wasn't the same man who disappeared. And what happened in those 15 missing months would haunt him for the rest of his life. May 5th, 1983, a Thursday morning. The sun was rising over the Berkshire Mountains in western Massachusetts. The air smelled like wet grass and wildflowers. Spring had finally arrived after a long, brutal winter. And in a grassy meadow just outside Pittsfield, a man opened his eyes. Stephen Kubacki blinked at the sky. Blue, cloudless, warm. He was lying on his back in an open field. His body ached, his head throbbed. His mouth was dry, tasting like copper and dirt. He sat up slowly, confused, disoriented. He looked down at himself. He was wearing a faded gray t-shirt he'd never seen before. Worn jeans that weren't his, sneakers that didn't fit quite right. His hands were calloused, dirty. There was a strange, faint scar on his left forearm that hadn't been there before. He stood up. His legs trembled beneath him. He looked around. The field stretched out in every direction. Trees lined the horizon. In the distance, he could see a road, cars passing by. Normal life continuing as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. He just didn't know what. Stephen touched his face. He had a beard, a thick, unkempt beard. He never wore a beard. He always kept himself clean-shaven, professional. But now his face was covered in coarse hair, weeks or maybe months old. His hair was longer too, shaggy, unkempt. He looked like a stranger. And then the panic set in. Where was he? How did he get here? The last thing he remembered was skiing, the frozen lake, the cold wind biting at his face, the sound of his skis cutting through snow. And then nothing. A void. A black hole where his memory should be. He tried to think, tried to remember, but there was only emptiness. A vast, terrible emptiness that made his chest tighten and his breath come in short gasps. He stumbled toward the road. His legs felt weak, unfamiliar, like he was learning to walk all over again. When he reached the pavement, he flagged down a passing car. An elderly woman stopped, her eyes wide with concern. She rolled down her window slowly, cautiously. Stephen must have looked like a madman, dirty, disheveled, wild-eyed. He asked her where he was. Pittsfield, Massachusetts, she told him. The date, May 5th, 1983. And then he asked her something that made her hands tighten on the steering wheel. What year is it? The woman stared at him. 1983, she repeated. Honey, are you okay? Do you need me to call someone? Stephen didn't answer. He just stood there, frozen. Because the last date he remembered was February 14th, 1982. 15 months ago. 15 months of his life were just gone. Erased. Vanished into a void he couldn't explain or understand. The woman drove him to the local police station. The officers were kind but confused. They took his statement, his name, his last known location. When he told them he'd been missing since February 1982, they exchanged glances. Skeptical glances. They ran his information. And that's when everything changed. Because Stephen Kubacki was in the system. He was listed as a missing person, presumed dead. There were records, search reports, a case file that had been closed over a year ago. The police called his parents. His mother answered the phone. When they told her that her son was alive, she dropped the receiver. The sound of her scream echoed through the station, even from hundreds of miles away. Within hours, Stephen's father was on a plane to Massachusetts. When he arrived at the station and saw his son sitting there, alive, breathing, real, he collapsed. He actually collapsed. The officers had to help him to a chair. He couldn't speak. He just stared at Stephen with tears streaming down his face. His son, his dead son, returned from the grave. But the reunion wasn't joyful. It was strange, uncomfortable, wrong. Because Stephen's father could see it immediately. Something was different. His son's eyes looked hollow, distant, like he was looking at the world from behind a thick pane of glass. When his father hugged him, Stephen's body was stiff, unresponsive, like he'd forgotten how to be held, like he'd forgotten what love felt like. They brought him back to Michigan, back to his apartment. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. His books, his notes, his coffee mug still sitting on the kitchen counter, a ring of dried coffee at the bottom. 15 months of dust covering everything like a funeral shroud. Stephen walked through the rooms like a ghost touring his own haunted house. Nothing felt real. Nothing felt right. The questions came fast. The police, the FBI, reporters. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Where have you been? What happened to you? How did you survive? And Stephen had no answers. None. His memory was a blank slate, a void. He remembered the ski trip. He remembered the cold. And then he remembered waking up in that field. Everything in between was just darkness. The doctors examined him. Physically, he was fine. Better than fine, actually. Despite being missing for over a year, he wasn't malnourished. He wasn't dehydrated. There were no signs of exposure or frostbite, no injuries, no trauma. His weight was normal. His vitals were strong. It was as if he'd been living a perfectly ordinary life somewhere. Eating, sleeping, existing. But where? And with whom? And why couldn't he remember any of it? They ran psychological evaluations, tested him for amnesia, dissociative fugue states, traumatic memory suppression. The psychiatrists had theories. Maybe he'd suffered a mental breakdown. Maybe the stress of his work had caused him to snap, to run away, to create a new identity. Maybe he'd been living as someone else for 15 months and his mind had simply blocked it all out to protect him. It was possible. It happened. People disappeared into new lives all the time. But Stephen didn't believe that. Because there were things, small things, strange things, things that didn't add up. The scar on his arm that he couldn't explain. The calluses on his hands in places where he'd never had calluses before. And the dreams. God, the dreams. Every night. Fragments. Flashes. Images that made no sense. Dark rooms. Fluorescent lights. The sound of machinery humming. Voices speaking in languages he didn't understand. And cold. Always cold. A deep, bone-penetrating cold that felt older than winter. Older than the ice on Lake Michigan. He tried to go back to work. Tried to resume his normal life. But he couldn't. Everything felt wrong. Food tasted different. Colors looked too bright. Sounds were too loud. He couldn't sleep in his own bed anymore. It felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else. He started sleeping on the floor, on the hardest surface he could find. Because somehow that felt more familiar, more right. His friends tried to help. They threw him a welcome back party. Balloons, cake, smiles. But Stephen just sat there staring at the candles, unable to smile back, unable to pretend. Because he knew the truth. He knew that whatever had happened to him during those 15 lost months had changed him, had hollowed him out, had replaced something essential inside him with something else, something he couldn't name. And the worst part, the part that kept him awake at night staring at the ceiling, he wasn't sure he wanted to remember, because deep down, in a place he didn't dare examine too closely, Stephen Kubacki was afraid. Afraid that if he ever recovered those missing memories, he would discover something so terrible, so incomprehensible, that it would destroy what little was left of the man he used to be. The man who walked out onto the ice was gone. And the man who woke up in that field, he was someone else entirely. Someone who had survived something that shouldn't be survived. And that's what haunted him most. The FBI opened a formal investigation 6 days after Stephen's return. Special Agent Marcus Holloway was assigned to the case. Holloway was a veteran investigator, calm and methodical, a man who'd seen everything from kidnappings to cult abductions. But even he admitted later that the Kubacki case unsettled him, because there was no crime, no ransom, no evidence of foul play. Just a man who had ceased to exist for 15 months and then reappeared 700 miles away with no explanation. Holloway started with the basics. He retraced Stephen's last known movements. The ski trail, the frozen lake, the abandoned equipment. He interviewed everyone who knew Stephen. His colleagues at the university described him as brilliant but isolated, a loner who preferred rocks to people. His neighbors barely knew he existed. One woman remembered seeing him leave that morning in February, carrying his skis. She waved. He didn't wave back. That was the last confirmed sighting. The FBI examined the clothes Stephen had been wearing when he woke up in Massachusetts. The gray t-shirt, the worn jeans, the sneakers. They ran every test available in 1983. Fiber analysis, soil samples, chemical traces. The results were maddeningly inconclusive. The clothes were generic, mass-produced, available in thousands of stores across the country. The soil on his shoes contained traces of clay and limestone, consistent with dozens of regions in the northeastern United States. Nothing unique, nothing traceable. But there was one detail that stood out. The jeans had a small label sewn into the waistband, a manufacturer's tag. The brand was common enough, but the production code indicated the jeans had been manufactured in late 1982, months after Stephen disappeared, which meant someone had dressed him in those clothes. Someone had put those shoes on his feet. Someone had kept him alive, fed him, clothed him for over a year, and then just let him go. Released him into that field like an animal back into the wild. Holloway broadened the investigation. He contacted police departments across 7 states. Had anyone reported seeing a man matching Stephen's description? Had there been any unusual activity in the Pittsfield area? Any reports of wandering amnesiacs? Any cult activity or commune sightings? The answers came back negative. Nothing. It was as if Stephen had materialized out of thin air. The psychiatrists continued their work. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a specialist in dissociative disorders, spent hours with Stephen trying to unlock his buried memories. She used hypnosis, guided visualization, free association techniques. Stephen cooperated fully. He wanted to remember, needed to remember, but every session ended the same way. Fragments, shadows, nothing concrete. Under hypnosis, he would sometimes speak in a monotone voice, describing sensations rather than events. Cold metal against his skin, the smell of antiseptic, bright lights that hurt his eyes, voices asking him questions he couldn't understand, and always, that bone-deep cold. Dr. Vasquez recorded everything. She filled notebooks with Stephen's fragmentary recollections, but she couldn't piece them together into a coherent narrative. It was like trying to assemble a puzzle with half the pieces missing and the remaining pieces from different puzzles entirely. She noted in her official report that Stephen's amnesia was unlike anything she'd encountered. It wasn't traumatic suppression. It wasn't organic brain damage. It was as if someone had surgically removed specific memories while leaving everything else intact. His childhood memories were perfect. His education, his skills, his personality, all unchanged. Only those 15 months were gone, cleanly excised. 3 months after his return, Stephen agreed to a polygraph test. He wanted to prove he wasn't lying, that he genuinely didn't remember. The examiner asked him the standard questions. Did you leave voluntarily? No. Were you held against your will? I don't know. Do you know where you were? No. Did anyone hurt you? I don't know. The results came back inconclusive. Not because Stephen was lying, but because his physiological responses were abnormal. His heart rate barely changed. His breathing remained steady. His galvanic skin response was almost flat. The examiner noted that Stephen appeared to be in a persistent state of mild dissociation, as if part of his nervous system had simply shut down. The media caught wind of the story. Newspapers ran headlines. Man returns from dead after 15 months. Michigan geologist's mysterious disappearance and return baffles authorities. Reporters camped outside Stephen's apartment. They called at all hours. They wanted interviews. They wanted answers. Stephen refused them all. He stopped going outside. He covered his windows with blankets. He unplugged his phone. The attention was suffocating him, but the theories spread anyway. Some people believed Stephen had suffered a psychotic break and wandered the country in a fugue state, taking odd jobs, living on the streets, his mind protecting him from the trauma by erasing it all. Others thought he'd been kidnapped by a survivalist cult in the wilderness, held in isolation, brainwashed, and then released when he was no longer useful. A few conspiracy theorists suggested government involvement, secret experiments, mind control programs. MKUltra hadn't been publicly exposed yet in 1983, but rumors were circulating. What if Stephen had been a test subject? The most disturbing theory came from Dr. Raymond Chen, a neurologist who had been following the case from a distance. He published a paper suggesting that Stephen might have experienced a rare form of temporal lobe epilepsy that created a prolonged, altered state of consciousness. In this state, Chen theorized, Stephen could have lived an entire parallel existence, performing complex tasks, interacting with people, maintaining his physical health, all while his conscious mind remained offline. When the seizure activity finally ceased, his brain rebooted, but the memories formed during the epileptic state were never transferred to long-term storage. They simply evaporated. It was a neat scientific explanation, but it didn't account for the geography. 700 miles from Michigan to Massachusetts. It didn't explain the new clothes, the scar, the calluses, and it certainly didn't explain the dreams, because the dreams were getting worse. Stephen started keeping a journal. Every morning, he would write down whatever fragments he could remember from the night before. The entries were disturbing. Dreamed I was in a white room, no windows, a door that wouldn't open, someone watching me through glass. I could feel their eyes, but I couldn't see them. Another entry. Dreamed of walking through snow, but the snow was warm and red, not blood. Something else, something wrong. And another. Dreamed I was underground, could hear water dripping, could hear breathing that wasn't mine, woke up with dirt under my fingernails. But I didn't go outside last night. I know I didn't. Dr. Vasquez read the journal. She was troubled by the consistency of certain symbols. The white room appeared in multiple entries. So did the sensation of being watched. And the cold. Always the cold. She suggested that these might be genuine memory fragments trying to surface. But without context, they were useless. Frightening, but useless. 6 months after his return, Stephen's father died. Heart attack. The doctors said it was sudden, unexpected, but Stephen knew better. He knew his father had never recovered from the shock, from the grief and confusion and impossible joy of having his son return from the dead, only to realize that the son who came back was fundamentally broken. At the funeral, Stephen stood beside the casket and felt nothing. No tears, no grief. Just that same hollow emptiness that had been living inside him since he woke up in that field. His mother took his hand. She looked at him with eyes full of pain and asked the question she'd been holding back for months. "Where were you, Stephen? Please, I need to know. Where did you go?" And Stephen looked at her. This woman who had given birth to him, who had raised him, who had mourned him. And he told her the only truth he had. "I don't know, Mom. But wherever it was, I don't think I was supposed to come back." The official investigation was closed in December 1983. No evidence of criminal activity, no leads worth pursuing. The FBI filed the case under unexplained disappearances and moved on. Agent Holloway kept a copy of the file in his personal records. He would revisit it sometimes over the years, always hoping for a breakthrough that never came. Before he retired in 1997, he gave an interview to a true crime podcast. He said the Kubacki case was the only one in his 30-year career that kept him awake at night. Because it wasn't just the mystery of where Stephen had been, it was the look in Stephen's eyes, the profound absence. Holloway said it was like looking at someone who had seen the other side of reality and could never unsee it. Stephen tried to rebuild his life. He went back to work part-time. He avoided social situations. He became even more of a recluse than he'd been before. His colleagues noticed he'd changed. He was quieter, more distant. He would sometimes stop mid-conversation and stare at nothing, his face blank, as if listening to something only he could hear. One co-worker asked him once if he was okay. Stephen turned to him and said something that made the man's blood run cold. "I used to think being alive was normal. Now I'm not so sure." The physical symptoms started about a year after his return. Stephen began experiencing temperature sensitivity. He couldn't tolerate heat. Even mild warmth made him nauseous and disoriented. He kept his apartment freezing. Windows open even in winter. He would sleep with ice packs. He told Dr. Vasquez that warmth felt wrong somehow. Unnatural. Like his body remembered being cold and was trying to return to that state. And then there were the episodes. Brief moments where Stephen would lose time. Minutes. Sometimes hours. He would come back to awareness in strange places. Once he found himself in his car, parked outside a warehouse he'd never seen before, with no memory of driving there. Another time he woke up in his bathtub, fully clothed, the water ice cold, his lips blue. These episodes terrified him, because they felt familiar, like echoes of those lost 15 months, like whatever had happened to him was still happening. Still pulling at him from somewhere beyond his conscious awareness. The silence from Stephen became a kind of answer in itself. He stopped trying to remember, stopped cooperating with researchers, stopped keeping the dream journal. He realized that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. And whatever was behind his door, whatever was waiting in those missing months, was something his mind had locked away for a reason. A very good reason. But the question remained, whispered in psychiatric circles, debated in FBI briefings. discussed in late-night conversations between people who had followed the case. What happened to Stephen Kubacki, and more importantly, who was taking care of him during those 15 months? Because someone was. Someone fed him, clothed him, kept him alive, and then, for reasons unknown, decided to give him back. In March of 1985, nearly 2 years after Stephen's return, something happened that changed everything. A letter arrived at the FBI field office in Detroit. It was addressed to Agent Marcus Holloway. The envelope had no return address. The postmark was smudged, illegible. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, like it had been written by someone with trembling hands, or someone very old, or someone very afraid. The letter read, "I know what happened to Stephen Kubacki. I was there. I saw him, but I can't come forward. They're watching. They're always watching. If you want the truth, look for the others. He wasn't the only one. Check missing persons reports from 1981 to 1983. Winter disappearances near large bodies of water. You'll find the pattern. But be careful. Some things are better left buried. Some people are better left missing." Holloway read the letter 3 times. His first instinct was to dismiss it as a hoax. The case had generated enough publicity that cranks and conspiracy theorists regularly sent tips. But something about this letter felt different. The tone wasn't sensational. It wasn't seeking attention. It was a warning. A genuine warning from someone who was terrified. Holloway did what the letter suggested. He ran a search through the National Crime Information Center database. Missing persons, winter months, near water. The parameters were broad, but the results were unsettling. Over the 3-year period mentioned, there were 17 cases that matched the pattern. 17 people who had disappeared during winter months in the vicinity of large lakes or rivers, vanished without a trace. And of those 17, 4 had eventually returned. 4 people, scattered across different states, all with the same impossible story. Gone for months, reappeared miles away, no memory of what happened. Holloway felt his pulse quicken. He requested the case files. It took weeks to gather them all. When they finally arrived on his desk, he spread them out and began to read. And what he found made his hands shake. Case 1. Jennifer Albright, age 29. Disappeared December 1981 while hiking alone near Lake Superior in Minnesota. Found 7 months later in rural Pennsylvania. She had been walking down a highway, barefoot, wearing a hospital gown. No hospital in the area had any record of her. She remembered nothing. Psychiatric evaluation noted severe dissociative symptoms and recurring nightmares about cold rooms and fluorescent lights. Case 2. Marcus Chen, age 41. Disappeared January 1982 while ice fishing on Lake Erie. Found 5 months later in upstate New York wandering through a shopping mall parking lot. He was wearing clothes that weren't his. He had lost 30 pounds. Medical examination revealed unusual scars on his torso, precise and surgical. He claimed to have no memory of anything after dropping his fishing line through the ice. Case 3. Rebecca Moss, age 33. Disappeared November 1982 during a solo kayaking trip on Lake Huron. Found 9 months later in Vermont, sitting on a park bench in the middle of the night. She was clean, well-fed, and completely unresponsive. It took 3 days before she spoke. When she finally did, she said only one thing, repeated over and over. "They let me go. I don't know why they let me go." Case 4. David Santos, age 38. Disappeared February 1983, the same month Stephen returned, while cross-country skiing near Lake Champlain. Found 4 months later in New Hampshire. He had been discovered by a farmer sleeping in a barn. Like Stephen, he had a beard he'd never had before. Like Stephen, he had no memory of the missing time. Like Stephen, he experienced severe temperature sensitivity and recurring episodes of lost time. 4 people, 4 impossible returns. And the similarities didn't end with the circumstances. Holloway noticed something else, something that made his throat tighten. All 4 had been interviewed by the same psychiatrist during their recovery, Dr. Philip Werner, a researcher affiliated with a private medical institute in upstate New York. Werner had somehow gained access to all 4 cases, conducted extensive evaluations, and then published nothing. No papers, no findings, no public record of his involvement at all. Holloway tried to contact Dr. Werner. The number listed for his office was disconnected. The medical institute claimed he no longer worked there. His medical license was still active, but his current address was listed as a P.O. box in a town that didn't exist. It was as if Werner had evaluated these 4 people and then vanished himself. Holloway made a decision. He contacted Stephen directly. They met at a diner outside Ann Arbor. Stephen looked worse than Holloway remembered, thinner, grayer. His eyes had that same hollow quality, but now there was something else there too. Fear. Deep, abiding fear. Holloway showed him the letter, showed him the case files, and he watched Stephen's face go pale. "There are others," Holloway said quietly. "4 that we know of. Maybe more. All of you disappeared near water in winter. All of you came back with no memory. All of you were evaluated by the same doctor who then disappeared." He paused. "Stephen, I need you to tell me the truth. Have you remembered anything? Anything at all?" Stephen was quiet for a long time. His hands were shaking. Finally he spoke. "I've been having more than dreams," he said. "I've been having visions. Waking visions. Flashbacks, I guess. They started about 6 months ago." He looked up at Holloway. "I see rooms, white rooms, medical equipment, and I see other people in beds, connected to machines. I can't see their faces clearly, but I know they're there, and I know they're like me." "Like you how?" "Taken," Stephen whispered. "We were all taken." Holloway leaned forward. "Taken by who?" Stephen shook his head. "I don't know. Every time I get close to seeing them, the memory stops. It's like there's a wall in my mind, something blocking me from seeing the whole picture. But I know one thing." He looked directly at Holloway. "Whoever they are, they're still out there, and they're still doing it." Holloway spent the next 3 months trying to track down the other survivors. Jennifer Albright had committed suicide in 1984, hung herself in her apartment. Her suicide note was 2 words long, "Too cold." Marcus Chen had disappeared again in early 1985. His car was found abandoned near Lake Michigan. He was never seen again. Rebecca Moss was in a psychiatric facility in Massachusetts, catatonic, unresponsive to any treatment. David Santos was the only one Holloway could reach. They met in a coffee shop in Portland, Maine, where Santos had relocated. He had changed his name, changed his entire life. He was working as a night security guard, a job where he could be alone, where he didn't have to interact with people, where he could watch the darkness and feel like he had some measure of control. He looked at Holloway with the same haunted eyes Stephen had. "I knew someone would come eventually," Santos said. "I knew this wasn't over." He pulled out a small notebook from his jacket pocket. "I've been keeping track. Every weird moment, every flash of memory, every time I lose time and come back." He slid the notebook across the table. "Read it." Holloway opened the notebook. Page after page of cramped handwriting. Dates, times, descriptions of fragmentary memories. And then he saw something that made his blood run cold. A sketch, crude but detailed. It showed a room with medical equipment, and in the corner of the room, barely visible, a symbol, a geometric pattern, circles within circles. Precise, deliberate. Holloway had seen this symbol before, in the margins of Dr. Werner's notes in the case files, the same exact pattern. "What is this?" Holloway asked. Santos leaned in close. His voice was barely above a whisper. "That's what I see in my dreams. That symbol. It was on the walls, on the equipment, on the clothes the people wore who came into the room. I've tried to research it, tried to find out what it means, but every time I get close, something happens. My computer crashes. Files disappear. Once I came home and someone had broken into my apartment. Nothing was stolen, but my research notes were gone. All of them. Who are they?" Holloway demanded. "I don't know," Santos said, "but they have resources, money, access. They can make people disappear. They can make records vanish. And they're careful, so careful. Whatever they did to us, whatever experiments or procedures or tests, They made sure we wouldn't remember. Made sure we couldn't tell anyone, even if we wanted to. He paused. But the mind doesn't forget. Not really. It just buries things. And sometimes those things claw their way back up. Holloway returned to Detroit with Santos's notebook. He began his own investigation, unofficial and off the books. He searched for the symbol. He searched for Dr. Werner. He searched for any connection between the 5 victims that might explain why they were chosen. Stephen was a geologist. Jennifer was a botanist. Marcus was an engineer. Rebecca was a teacher. David was an architect. Different professions, different backgrounds. No obvious connection, except for one thing. Holloway found it buried in their medical records. All 5 had participated in a university study in the late 1970s, a sleep study conducted by the same medical institute where Dr. Werner had worked. The study was titled Cold Weather Sleep Patterns and Cognitive Function. All 5 had been paid volunteers. They had spent weekends at a research facility, sleeping in climate-controlled rooms while researchers monitored their brain activity. The institute still existed. Holloway drove there in May 1985. It was a sprawling complex outside Syracuse, New York. Modern, clean, surrounded by high fences and security cameras. He showed his credentials at the gate, asked to speak with someone about the 1970s sleep studies. The security guard made a call. 5 minutes later, 2 men in suits appeared. They were polite but firm. The studies he was asking about were classified. Proprietary research. They couldn't discuss it, and perhaps Agent Holloway should speak with his supervisors before making any more inquiries. Holloway left, but as he drove away, he looked in his rear-view mirror. One of the suited men was writing down his license plate number. 3 days later, Holloway was called into his supervisor's office. The conversation was brief and unambiguous. Drop the Kubacki case. Drop all related inquiries. It was closed. There was no evidence of federal crimes, no jurisdiction for further investigation, and any continued pursuit would be seen as insubordination. Holloway tried to argue, tried to explain what he'd found. His supervisor cut him off. "Marcus, I'm going to give you some advice. Let this go. There are people very interested in making sure this stays buried. People with more power than you or me. If you keep pushing, you'll lose more than your job." Holloway went home that night and burned his personal copies of the case files, all except one, Stephen's original file. That one he kept, hidden, just in case. He called Stephen one last time, told him to be careful, told him to stop digging, told him that whatever had happened, whatever had been done to them, was protected by forces they couldn't fight. Stephen's response was quiet, resigned. "I know," he said. "I've known for a while now. Some cages don't have bars. Some prisons don't have walls. We're free, Agent Holloway, but we'll never really be free, because they're still watching. And if we get too close to the truth, they'll just take us again. And next time, they won't let us come back." The line went dead. Holloway never spoke to Stephen Kubacki again. Stephen Kubacki lived the rest of his life in the shadows. He never married, never had children, never returned to geology or academia. He worked a series of quiet jobs: library assistant, night janitor, data entry clerk, jobs where he could be invisible, jobs where no one asked questions, jobs where he could disappear into the background of the world and pretend he was normal. But he wasn't normal, and he knew it. The episodes of lost time continued throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s. Sometimes he would lose an hour, sometimes a whole day. He would come back to consciousness in strange places. Once he found himself standing in the parking lot of that medical institute in Syracuse, 200 miles from his home, with no memory of how he got there. He got in his car and drove away as fast as he could. He never went back. The temperature sensitivity never improved. If anything, it got worse. Stephen kept his apartment so cold that ice would form on the windows even in summer. Visitors were rare, but when they came, they would comment on the frigid air. Stephen would just smile tightly and say he ran hot. But the truth was darker. The truth was that warmth felt like a betrayal of something his body remembered, but his mind couldn't access. Cold was familiar. Cold was home, and that terrified him more than anything else. The dreams evolved over the years. They became more vivid, more specific. By the mid-1990s, Stephen could describe entire sequences: the White Room, the machinery, the feeling of being observed. And sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, he would dream of the others: Jennifer, Marcus, Rebecca, David. He would see them in beds next to his, connected to the same machines, breathing in the same cold air. And he would wake up crying because he knew, somehow he knew, that they had all been together, that whatever happened had happened to all of them simultaneously. A shared nightmare that none of them could fully remember, but none of them could escape. In 1998, Stephen received a package in the mail, no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping, an obituary. David Santos had died, heart failure at age 53. But there was something else in the package, a handwritten note, just one sentence, in handwriting Stephen didn't recognize. "You're the last one now. Stay quiet." Stephen burned the note, burned the package, but he couldn't burn the message from his mind. He was the last one, the last survivor of whatever had happened. Jennifer was dead. Marcus was missing. Rebecca was catatonic. David was dead. And Stephen was alone with memories that weren't quite memories and a truth that could never be spoken. The years passed. Stephen grew older. His hair turned white. His body grew frail. But his mind remained sharp. Too sharp. He could still feel it. That presence, that watching. Like he was a specimen in an experiment that never ended. Like his entire life after waking up in that field had been part of a long-term study. What happens to a human mind when you remove 15 months of experience? What happens to a soul when you take it apart and put it back together wrong? He was the data. His suffering was the result. And somewhere, someone was still taking notes. In 2003, 20 years after his return, Stephen did something he had never done before. He agreed to an interview. A small true crime podcast run by a graduate student researching unexplained disappearances. The student had found Stephen through old newspaper archives and convinced him, after months of persistent but respectful emails, to talk. The interview was conducted over the phone. Stephen's voice was quiet, tired, but clear. The student asked him the question everyone wanted answered. "After all these years, do you have any idea what happened to you during those 15 months? And Stephen paused. The silence stretched out for almost a minute. Finally he spoke. "I have theories," he said. "I have fragments. I have nightmares that feel more real than my waking life. But the truth, the actual truth? No, I don't know. And I've made peace with that, because I think the not knowing is part of it. I think they wanted us to come back broken. To come back knowing something had been done to us, but never knowing exactly what. That's a special kind of torture. The uncertainty, the gaps. It's worse than any clear memory could ever be." The student pressed. "Who is they?" Stephen laughed. It was a bitter sound. "If I knew that," he said, "I'd either be dead or I'd be back in that white room. Some questions don't have safe answers. Some truths are designed to destroy the people who discover them. I learned that a long time ago." The interview ended shortly after. The podcast episode aired to a small audience. A few hundred listeners. Nothing viral. Nothing that would draw attention. Stephen preferred it that way. He had said what he needed to say. He had left his testimony for the record. If something happened to him, if he disappeared again or died mysteriously, at least someone would know. Someone would remember. Stephen Kubacki died on November 19, 2015 at the age of 67. He was found in his apartment by a neighbor who hadn't seen him in several days. The official cause of death was hypothermia, which would have been unremarkable except for one detail. It was November. The heat in his apartment was working, but Stephen had turned it off. He had opened all the windows, he had stripped down to his underwear, and he had lain down on his bed and let the cold take him. The police ruled it suicide. The coroner disagreed. There was no note, no signs of depression or suicidal ideation in his recent behavior. Stephen had simply made himself cold and stopped fighting to stay warm. like he had finally given in to something his body had been calling him toward for 33 years, like he had finally gone home. Among his possessions, the police found boxes of journals, decades worth of dreams and fragmentary memories and theories written in increasingly shaky handwriting. They also found something else, a single photograph. It had been tucked into the back of a book on Stephen's nightstand. The photograph showed 5 people standing together. Stephen recognized himself, young, smiling, and next to him 4 other people: Jennifer Albright, Marcus Chen, Rebecca Moss, David Santos. They were all smiling, all healthy, all whole. The photograph was dated November 1977. The back of the photo had a stamp: Great Lakes Sleep Research Institute. Thank you for your participation. It was the only physical evidence that the 5 of them had ever been in the same place at the same time. The only proof that they had been chosen together. The police logged it as a personal memento and returned it to Stephen's next of kin. His elderly mother, now in her 90s, looked at the photograph and wept. She had never seen it before, had never known her son had been part of any study, had never understood what had been done to him or why. The medical institute that conducted the sleep study no longer exists. The building still stands outside Syracuse, but it's been converted into office space for insurance companies and tech startups. The original research records were destroyed in a fire in 1989. Convenient, complete. No paper trail, no evidence, no accountability. Agent Marcus Holloway died in 2008. In his will, he left instructions for his personal files to be donated to the FBI archives. Among those files was Stephen Kubaki's case, the original file, complete with Holloway's handwritten notes, his theories, his suspicions, and a final entry dated 2007, 1 year before his death. It read, "I spent 30 years as a federal agent. I've seen terrible things. I've hunted serial killers and terrorists and monsters in human skin. But the Kubaki case haunts me more than all of them combined, because those monsters I could understand. I could catch them. I could stop them. But the people who took Stephen and the others, they're still out there. They have institutional protection. They have resources beyond anything I could fight. And they're still doing it. I know they are. Because people still disappear near water in winter. And some of them still come back wrong. If you're reading this, if you found this file, please, don't let Stephen's story be forgotten. Don't let him be just another cold case. He deserved better. They all deserved better. The file remains in the FBI archives. Unsolved. Unexplained. A footnote in the vast catalog of American mysteries. But Stephen's story raises questions that go beyond one man's tragedy. Questions about consent and power. About what institutions are allowed to do to ordinary people in the name of research or national security or progress. Questions about the nature of memory and identity. If 15 months of your life were erased, are you still the same person? If your mind is tampered with, if your memories are stolen, do you still own yourself? Or have you become something else? A copy? An approximation? A ghost wearing your own skin? And then there's the deepest question. The one that kept Stephen awake during those long, cold nights. The one that probably drove him to open those windows on that final November evening. If he couldn't remember what happened during those 15 months, how could he be sure it had stopped? How could he know he wasn't still there, in that white room, dreaming that he had escaped? How could he trust that his entire life after waking up in that field wasn't just another layer of the experiment, another cage? Another test. There's a philosophy concept called brain in a vat. The idea that you could be a disembodied brain floating in a laboratory somewhere, being fed electrical signals that create the illusion of lived experience. You can't prove you're not a brain in a vat. You can't verify that your reality is real. You just have to have faith. Stephen Kubaki lost that faith. Somewhere between the frozen lake and the warm field, between the white room he couldn't remember and the cold apartment where he died, Stephen lost the ability to trust his own existence. And that might be the cruelest thing they did to him. Not the abduction, not the lost time, but the doubt. The eternal gnawing doubt that poisoned every moment of his life afterward. We like to think that survival is always a victory, that coming home is always a happy ending. But Stephen's story teaches us something darker. Sometimes the cost of survival is too high. Sometimes coming back means bringing something terrible with you. A wound that won't heal, a cold that won't leave, a question that can never be answered. Stephen Kubacki walked out onto the ice in February 1982 as one person. He woke up in a field in May 1983 as someone else, and he spent the next 33 years trying to figure out who that someone else was. He never succeeded. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the experiment was to see how long a human being could survive in a state of existential uncertainty. How long before the not knowing becomes unbearable. For Stephen, it was 33 years. 33 years of cold apartments and lost time and dreams of white rooms. 33 years of being watched by invisible eyes and haunted by memories that existed just beyond his grasp. 33 years of being the last survivor of something that should never have happened. And then, finally, he stopped fighting the cold. He let it in. He let it take him. And maybe, in some terrible way, that was his escape. Not death exactly, but a return. A completion of a circle that began on a frozen lake in 1982. The cold had called him then, and the cold claimed him in the end. There are still people who disappear near large bodies of water in winter. The statistics haven't changed. Some are accidents, some are suicides, some are murders, and some are something else, something we don't have a name for, something that takes people apart and sometimes, rarely, puts them back together just different enough that we notice, just broken enough that they can never be whole again. If you ever find yourself alone near cold water in the deep of winter, pay attention. Listen, because Stephen's story teaches us that some forces don't announce themselves. They don't ask permission, they simply take. And if they take you, if you're one of the unlucky ones who comes back, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering where you really are, wondering if you ever really came back at all. Stephen Kubacki shouldn't have survived those 15 months. The cold should have killed him. The lake should have taken him. But he did survive, and that's what haunted him most. Not the mystery of where he was, but the horror of what he became. The unbearable knowledge that survival isn't always salvation. Sometimes it's just a longer, slower way to die. His story ends in that cold apartment. Windows open, body still, finally at peace with the temperature that had been calling him home for over 3 decades. But the larger story, the story of what was done to him and why and by whom, that story has no ending. It continues in the files that were destroyed, in the institutions that still stand, in the winter disappearances that still happen every year, in the few who come back wrong and spend their lives trying to remember what was taken from them. Stephen's last words, spoken in that podcast interview in 2003, were these: "If you're listening to this and something similar has happened to you, if you've lost time and can't explain it, if you came back from somewhere and don't know where, I want you to know you're not alone. You're not crazy. Something real happened. Something was done. And the fact that you can't remember it doesn't make it any less true. The absence of memory is itself a kind of evidence. The gap is the proof. Hold on to that, because it's all we have. He shouldn't have survived, but he did, and that's what haunted him most.